Hi, it's Colleen. Welcome back to my sewing channel. Sorry if you happen to hear some background noise of the furnace and a heater. Since I got rid of a lot of my fabric in my sewing room, it's freezing down here. We're in a cold snap and it's just cold without all the extra stuff in this room. I wanted to talk about marking fabric. I am in the middle of making some projects and I need to be able to mark some of the pattern instructions onto my fabric. So for example, I have this pattern piece and I would want to be able to mark the dart or this placement line onto my fabric as I'm cutting it out. But the issue is that not all marking methods work the same depending on what your fabric is or what you're trying to do. And so I thought it'd be a good time to talk about all the different types of marking options that there are and tell you my favorites, kind of the pros and cons of each of them. So I'm going to start with sort of the ubiquitous, chalk. It's really easy to buy tailor's chalk that comes in a lot of different colors. I have blue and white. These pieces I've had forever and always. But I also have recently purchased a pack that has the blue, the white, the yellow, the red. You can draw your mark and it makes a nice clear line. You can see that right there. You would use the blue on light fabrics and the white on dark fabrics. So you can see that. Really handy. The issue is that these are it's like when you have a pencil that's really sharp. It's great. You can write and be very detailed with your stuff, but when that starts to get dull over time, the pencil mark makes wider and wider marks. It's less crisp. The same thing happens with these. So right now, that's a pretty thick line, and I might not want that much on my fabric as I'm working. So it does have a little bit of a drawback. Here's another option. This is chalk, but it's in like a powder form. And there's a little tiny wheel here that you run across the fabric and it makes the mark. So let me show you this on this fabric. So you can see the difference. It's a much finer line, but I think you can buy different color chalk. I just have sort of this blue color, which is a little bit tough to see on a light colored fabric. I don't even think you can see that. It's hard to see even in regular light. But that's handy if you have a dark colored fabric. The problem with it is that this wheel is bumpy. It's like a little gear, so certain fabrics don't like that. It'll kind of snag and grab. Then you have pencils. These are marking pencils. This one's water soluble. I guess they both say they're water soluble. One's blue and one's white. Those are also useful, so I can write on there. So this is maybe, I want to say that's a collar piece, and I can just write my note directly onto the fabric. They are erasable. So here I have something, it's called a fabric eraser. I think you can use any kind of eraser actually, but this came with a kit of other marking tools. But that does allow you to erase to an extent. I believe you can even erase the other types of chalk. It doesn't have to be the pencil, but it's not always a clean erasure. See, it kind of smears it. So that is a drawback to using these, but these pencils are water soluble, so you can just wash them out if your fabric is washable. Here's another great thing I've discovered recently is marking pens that go away with heat. So I can just iron over the marks once I'm done. So for example, if I wanted to mark a dart placement, if I wanted to mark my notches, I can. And then I can just take it over to the iron and press the mark right out, which I'll show you right now. You can see my mark here. That was made with the heat pen. And now when I'm done with my sewing or I'm done with whatever it is that I needed the marking for, I can just go right over it and it disappears with heat. So it's completely gone. Another option for marking patterns is to use tracing paper. The wax-free tracing paper is very common. You see it in stores like Joann. Usually comes in a few different colors. This packet has white, blue, yellow, red. My issue with this is that it's very difficult to see the marks. Basically, you would lay it color side down onto your fabric and then you would go over your pattern with a tracing wheel. And I have a couple different styles here. This one has an edge that looks like a gear. It's got teeth on it. So you would draw over your lines this way and it leaves a mark, but it's very difficult to see that mark. And I have found that changing to a solid wheel is a little bit better, but it's still not great. You see that mark there? It's just really faint. Here's the blue. You can see that makes a pretty dark mark, but it depends on how old your paper is and how often you've used it. I just have found that these are iffy on their performance. And so I have a couple of them. I actually ended up just throwing away a whole packet of it because I couldn't get any of them to work. They don't last forever. They seem to fade or rub off and become less effective. These are really easy to find. But what I really like, and if you can find them, you see these are all vintage. So I got them somewhere along the way. I can't remember, but they're vintage, quite old, but they work wonderfully. These are waxed tracing paper. They make a much brighter mark. I think the only issue for using them just might be that they're a little more difficult to remove. So I'll try this blue on here, and you'll see how nice and bright and sharp that line is. It's very easy to see. So I really prefer this waxed paper much more than the wax-free paper that's available in the stores. It's a little harder to find, and I know you can order it online from a handful of places. It's expensive. It definitely costs more than the wax-free stuff, but it literally lasts forever. So here is a big sheet of red that has been, you can probably see it's been marked and marked and marked, but it still works wonderfully. If I turn that over and run over my fabric, you can see nice, easy to see, crisp, clear lines. Waxed paper is much better than the wax-free tracing paper. Here's another wonderful tool. This is made by Clover. It allows you to mark the seam line with one wheel and the seam allowance with the other wheel, and you can set these little gears to be whatever you want them to be. So you can see there's slots on the end of the tool, and then on the side there's markings that indicate the different widths that you need. So for example, this, if I measure with my seam gauge, I can see that that is set for a 5/8 inch seam, which is a standard seam allowance. So if I wanted to mark my pattern piece with the seam line plus add my 5/8 inch seam allowance, I can mark that all in one step. So I have my fabric here, I have my tracing paper here, wax side down, and I have my pattern piece that I lay right on top. Now I can just roll across with one roller on the seam line and the other is exactly 5/8 inch away. Now you do have to press firmly to make sure both of those wheels are in contact with the paper, but then I can just mark right along like this, and it should mark both of those lines at one time, which is a huge time saver, because the option you have is to draw that seam line on or just carefully cut and try and guesstimate how much that is away from there. So here you can see that piece is perfectly marked on my fabric with seam line and seam allowance. So I know right where to cut and right where to sew. It's a great little tool, but it would never show up that well with the wax-free paper, I have to say. Now a really easy, low-cost, low-tech way to mark stuff is to just use pins and a pen or a pencil. And the way you would do that is you would pin the point that you want to mark on your pattern and then mark with your pen around the pin. Let me show you. This is a piece of the dress that I'm working on, and these dots indicate the placement of snaps. So you would want to mark your fabric for where those snaps are. One way to do that is to just use a pin. So I have a straight pin and I'm going to poke it directly through the center of that dot like this. And then I'm going to lift the paper while the pin is still through the fabric and use my pen to mark where it goes through. I used a red pen to just draw right where that pin goes through the paper. Then I can lay my pattern down, pick up my pin, and go to the next one. The same process, poke it right through the center, lift the paper away, use your pen to mark where that pen, that's hard to say, use your pen to mark where the pin goes through, and so on. You can move your way down the pattern that way. So there you go. I took it off and I can see exactly where my snap placement is. You can use a pen or a pencil, or you can use one of these other marking pencils to do that, but the straight pen is the trick. Slide it through, mark, and then move to the next thing. Another way is to use thread. So you can use thread tracing or tailor's tacks to be able to mark things. Let me show you what thread tracing looks like. I've cut this out on the seam line, but I don't necessarily want to cut a standard seam allowance. Maybe I want to leave a 1 inch or a 2 inch seam allowance because I'm trying to fit this very carefully to a body and I want to make sure I have plenty of room to work. So what I might want to do is mark the seam line, and then I can just cut it out on my own without having to follow a particular seam allowance. So what I would do is I would pin this pattern to the fabric just like this. Make sure it's pinned very carefully. And then I would follow around the edge of this pattern piece to mark the seam line. I'm just going to use some contrasting thread to stitch right along the seam line. Now I'm going to start with a little back stitch just to anchor my thread. And just a single thread will do. You can use scrap thread for this because you don't need anything fancy. As long as you can see it, you're fine. This can be a little tedious to do, but it's important for certain types of fabric that you don't want to use any kind of a mark on. So for example, if you're sewing with silk, you can't use a water-soluble pencil or marker because it's going to end up staining that fabric. You can, get away with chalk on a cotton or something that's really easy to wash or clean up, but you can't do that necessarily on velvet, for example. I think I have picked the dullest needle that I happen to own. It's dull and it's fat. But the idea is that you're just stitching right along that seam line and tracing it. Thread tracing, that's what it is. It's a good lesson on using the right needle for the job. So I had a thick needle and this is too tightly woven, this mock-up cotton that I'm using for that needle. So a thinner, sharper needle does the trick. But basically just go along and trace the entire pattern piece. And then when you're done, you can see the whole shape right where it was, and that would become your stitching line, and then you can cut out whatever kind of seam allowance you want. It's a great way to go. Very time consuming, but certain fabrics require it. The last option I want to show you is called a tailor's tack. So a tailor's tack uses, again, needle and thread, and you mark through the little dots and points on your pattern. The benefit is that it leaves threads behind and you can mark both sides of the fabric at once. So for example, say I was going to cut out a pattern piece on the fold. So this is a folded piece of fabric for demonstration. And say it's a dress front, and I want to be able to mark the darts on both sides of that dress front piece of fabric in one go. A tailor's tack allows you to do that. So using our example pattern piece from before where we had these dots to include snaps, I can mark that with a tailor's tack. And here's how you do that. So I've got my needle and thread, and I'm just going to sew through the paper pattern in both layers of my fabric, and then leave a very loose loop and come back up through the fabric. So see, I'm not pulling it tight, I'm leaving it loose, and I'm straight through the pattern piece and everything. Now I just trim off my needle. I can pull off my fabric and it leaves behind the thread. Now I can very carefully open this up, snip in the middle, and now I have the same point marked on both sides of the fabric. That's called a tailor's tack. You can do that for seam lines. You can make really loose loops. I can go all the way down, for example, a line of stitching, like a placement line with really loose, big stitches. And then when I go to trim it off, I can just snip along those loops and leave the bits of thread in the fabric to mark where I need to mark. Editing Colleen here. I realized I forgot one really common tool, and that is the disappearing ink marking pens. Essentially, they're air and water soluble markers, and you mark your markings on the fabric. Over time, about 48 hours, the marks will disappear with exposure to air, or you can use a damp cloth to wipe away your marks, or just wash your fabric to get the marks out. I have a few problems with these. One is that they don't show up on dark fabrics. Also, they don't always come out, so maybe they don't disappear all the way or they don't wash out all the way. And finally, if you want to mark your fabric and then walk away and come back to your project later, you might just find that all of your markings have disappeared. But anyway, I wanted to include them here so you could see them because they are very common and a lot of people love them. That was just a quick overview of the various types of marking methods that are available. You'll really just have to experiment to find out what you like best and what works best for the fabrics that you're working with. Definitely test some samples because some fabrics will do fine with the chalk and others won't. And you'll want to make sure that you can get those marks out when you need to on the finished product. And if you can't, you'll definitely want to try a different marking method. Try some of these methods out if you haven't already, and let me know which ones are your favorite. You can put those in the comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe if you like what you see here, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.